cold. Hold on. Let me take off my headscarf 1 minute. Okay. Hopefully this is better. All right, we are going to continue in the Holy War made by Shaddai upon Diabolos for the regaining of the metropolis of the world by John Bunyan, who is the author of Pilgrim's Progress. Chapter 11. Emmanuel confronts Diabolos. Emmanuel ordered Captain Borginis, Captain Conviction, Captain Judgment, and Captain Execution to immediately march up to Eargate while sounding their trumpets and flying their colors. He then ordered Captain Credence to join them. And to emphasize this show of strength, he told them to approach with a battle shout. After adding Captain Credence to the attacking force, Emmanuel ordered Captain Good Hope and Captain Charity to draw up their troops before Highgate. He strategically placed the remaining captains and their men around the town for the best advantage against the enemy. All these under the town for the best advantage against the enemy. All those under his authority did everything they were commanded. Then he ordered that the word should go before them, and that the word at that time was Emmanuel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John chapter 1, verse 1. An alarm sounded, and the battering rams were put into motion along with the slings, which whirled huge stones into the main part of town. And so this is how the battle began. Diabolos himself controlled and directed the townsmen who were positioned to every gate. Their resistance was strong and more wicked and aggressive toward Emmanuel. Diabolos and Mansoul kept the good prince busy by for several days, and it was a sight to behold how the captain of Shaddai handled themselves in the war. Captain Boriges started the fight by making 3 fierce assaults upon Eargate, one after another, causing the post of the gate to shake. And remember that Boriges, that means sons of thunder. Captain Conviction caught up with Boriges, and both men perceived the gate was beginning to yield. Armed with this knowledge, they commanded the battering rams to continue the surge against the gate. Now Captain Conviction rode up near the gate, but he was driven back with great force. He received 3 wounds to the mouth, but some of the military who had been driven back in this fashion still went about to encourage the captains. When the prince heard about the valor shown by these 2 captains, he sent for them to come to his pavilion and commanded them to rest a while to refresh themselves. Care was also shown for Captain Conviction to heal his wounds, and the prince gave each of them a chain of gold and told them to take courage. Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord. Psalm 27:14. Captain Good Hope and Captain Charity fought well in this desperate fight, as they came against Highgate and almost broke it open. These captains also received a reward from their prince because they fought valiantly. In this engagement, several of Diabolos' officers were slain and some of the townsmen wounded. Among the slain officers was Captain Boasting, who thought nobody could shake the post of Eargate or raise doubt in the heart of Diabolos. Captain Secure was killed. He was the captain who said even the blind and lame in man's soul could protect against Emmanuel's army and keep the gates from falling. Captain Conviction cut off the head of this Captain Secure with a 2-handed sword, but he received the 3 wounds in his mouth at that time. At Highgate, Captain Good Hope inflicted a mortal wound in the breast of Captain Bragman, a popular fellow who was captain over a company of soldiers that threw firebrands and arrows. Beyond that, Mr. Feeling, who wasn't a captain, was wounded in the eye by one of Borgini's soldiers. Mr. Feeling was a great one for standing on the sidelines to encourage Mansoul to rebel and would have been killed by the captain himself if he hadn't made a hasty retreat. And I'd never seen Will so intimidated in all my life. He wasn't able to do as he customarily did, and some of the men in the prince's army saw him limp after he'd walked upon the wall and said he had received a leg wound. I won't go on with all the details and names of the soldiers who were slain in the town, for many were maimed, wounded, and slain. Projectiles flung by the golden slings hit their mark, and the force of the strike knocked the Diabolans from their feet and sent them tumbling through the air into the midst of the town of Mansoul. They lay scattered on the ground, watching as the post of Eargate shook and Igate splintered. With the gate closed, being broken open, and some of their captains slain, the courage of many of them melted away. Love No Good, who was a townsman but also a Diabolan, was mortally wounded, but his life lingered for a time. And remember Mr. Illpaws? He's the one who came with Diablos when he first attempted to take Mansoul. He received a serious head wound. Some reported that he suffered from a cracked skull. One thing I can tell you for sure is that since this incident, he's never been able to harm Mansoul as he's done in the past. Plus, Old Prejudice and Mr. Anything fled away. Now, when the battle was over, the prince commanded the white flag to be set upon Mount Gracious, once more in sight of the town of Mansoul. He did this to show the wretched town of Mansoul that Emmanuel still offered the gift of grace. For by grace have you been saved through faith, and not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8 and 9. Diablo saw the white flag hung out again and knew it wasn't for him, but for Mansoul. So he figured out another trick to play to see if he could get Emmanuel to remove his besieging army and relinquish his attempt to take Mansoul. Maybe if Diablos promised reformation of Mansoul. With this plan in mind, he came down to the gate one evening a good while after the sun had set and called to speak with Emmanuel. Emmanuel responded and came down to the gate. Hold on 1 minute. Okay. Diablos addressed him, seeing that your white flag makes it appear you are devoted to peace and quiet. I thought it a good idea to let you know we are ready to accept this, if you permit these terms. I know you are dedicated to devotion and that holiness pleases you. The corner of Diablo's mouth lifted in a half smile. Yes, I understand your purpose in making war upon Mansoul, so it may be a holy habitation. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of God's household, having been built on the cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, is growing into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling of God in the Spirit. Ephesians chapter 2, 19 through 22. I don't believe I've ever read it like that before. Can I just read that one more time? So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of God's household, being built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, is growing into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling of God in the Spirit. Wow. Ephesians chapter 2, 19 through 22. I am here to say that if you withdraw your forces from the town, I will make Mansoul submissive and cause them to bow to you. First, I will put hostility against you to rest, and shall willingly become your deputy. Putting forth the same effort I formerly used to work against you, I will now serve you in the town of Mansoul. I will persuade man's soul to receive you as Lord. Once they see I am your deputy, I know they will do it sooner. I will also show them that they have erred and how sin stands in the way to life. I'll show the holy law with them, show them how they have broken it, and explain they must conform to it. I will impress upon them the necessity of life reformed according to your law. I can put things in place so none of these things fail. I will even pay for the cost of setting up and maintaining a competent ministry that lectures in man's soul. And as a token of our coming under your control, you will receive whatever you see fit to levy upon us. Emmanuel listened patiently, but wasn't fooled by Diabolos's ploy. He said, "O you who are full of deceit, your ways are ever changing. His mouth is full of curses and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue is mischief and wickedness." Psalm chapter 10, verse 7. How often you have changed what you say and do and then changed again, all to pretend you are mighty enough to keep possession of my man's soul. The fact is, I have been declared the rightful heir of man's soul. You often make proposals, and these you've most recently fabricated are no better than the ones that came before. The point is, you fail to deceive when you show your true colors. But now you transform yourself into an angel of light and are trying to deceive me into thinking you are now as a minister of righteousness. No wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore, it is not surprising if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, whose end will be according to their deeds. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 13 through 14. But, Diablos, you know nothing can be respected that you purpose or propose, for your only motive is to deceive. You have no conscience toward God, nor do you love the town of man's soul. For this reason, is it not obvious that the things you have said arise from sinful purposes and deceit? And to that point, if righteousness is such a beautiful thing in your eyes now, how is it you have stuck so closely to the wickedness in the past? He who proposes whatever he pleases with the intent to destroy those who believe him should be abandoned, and everything he has said should be discounted. Hold on 1 minute. Hello, how are you? I read live actually, so I can't read the chat and this, but welcome, welcome, welcome. There's a lots of books that you could listen to. Let's continue. You talk about reformation in man's soul and even say you will head that reformation. You say this knowing the best that man can accomplish through the righteousness of the law will amount to nothing in regard to taking away the curse from man's soul. For man's soul cannot be delivered from a curse pronounced by God for breaking a law by obeying the law. To say nothing of a reformation set up in man's soul, in which the devil is to become the corrector of evil. You know all you have said in this manner is nothing but craftily disguised deceit. It is the first and last card you have to play. For now only a few see through the disguise you wear, and while you may be dressed in white light, soon many will discern what you really are when you show them your cloven feet. For you will not deceive my man soul in this way, Diablos, for I still love my man soul. I didn't come to push man's soul to live by works. If I did, I would be like you. I come so that by me and by what I have done and will do for man's soul, they may be reconciled to my Father, even though they have provoked him to anger by their sin and can't obtain mercy by the law. Now all these things are from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation, namely, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and he has committed to us the word of reconciliation. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 18 and 19. You talk about placing man's soul under the power of good when no one deserves it at your hands. My Father sent me to possess the town and guide it to be pleasing in his sight by bringing it into conformity to his will. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Consequently, I will possess man's soul and will strip you of your position and cast you out. I will pull this town down and rebuild it. I'll set up a sovereign power for myself in the heart of them and will govern them by new laws, new officers, new motives, and a new way. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creature. The old things passed away. I read that again. Behold, new things have come. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 18. It will be as though the old never existed, for it will become the glory of the whole universe. When Diablos heard this, it became clear to him that Prince Emmanuel had discovered his deceptions. He was put to shame and so embarrassed that at first he couldn't decide what to do. But then he tapped into the fountain of iniquity, rage, and malice which sprung up within him. In his art turned all he held against Shaddai and his son and the beloved town of Mansoul. Deliberating on this renewed his strength and readied him for a fresh battle against the noble Prince Emmanuel. And with his renewed determination, he demanded another fight take place before the town of Mansoul could be taken. For those of you who love to see military action, come up to the mountains and watch both sides of the battle, and you'll witness how the fatal blow is delivered. You'll see how one seeks to hold, while the other seeks to make himself master of the famous town of Mansoul. Diablos withdrew from the wall and returned to his strength and power at the heart of the town of Mansoul. Emmanuel also returned to his camp. With their differences and intentions clear, both drew into a battle posture, ready to fight. Filled with despair about losing control of the famous town of Mansoul, Diablos decided to do what harm he could to the army of the prince and to the famous town of Mansoul. Unfortunately, Mansoul, he wasn't concerned about the happiness. I'm sorry, how did I repeat that? Unfortunately for Mansoul, he wasn't concerned about the happiness of the silly town. His plan was to bring it to utter ruin and to destroy everything within sight. With this plan in mind, he commanded his officers to render what harm and damage they could by drawing men, women, and children apart. And when the time should come that they saw the town could no longer be held, he said, be sure to demolish the place and leave it a ruinous heap. Better that than to leave it for Emmanuel to move in and make it his home. Chapter 12, Emmanuel's victory. Emmanuel knew the outcome of the next battle could result in his being made master of the place. He issued a royal command to all his officers, high captains, and men of war. Against Diablos and all the Diablins, be sure to show yourself men of war. But to the old inhabitants of Mansoul, the natives, show yourselves favorable, merciful, and meek. With this in mind, direct the fury of the front line of battle against Diablos and his men. When the day of battle arrived, the command was given. The prince's men bravely put on their armor and weapons and headed into battle. Put on the full armor of God, so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 11. They followed the prince's command and focused most on their strength and energy against ear gate and eye gate. Word spread, Mansoul is won, and so they made their assault upon the town. Diablos responded to the prince's arm as quickly as possible, placing the main power of his high lords and chief captains to resist from within man's soul. For a time, they fought cruelly against the prince's army. But after 3 or 4 remarkable charges by the prince and his noble captains, Eargate was broken open. The bars and bolts, which had once worked to secure the town against the prince, broke into thousands of pieces. The prince's trumpets sounded, the captain shouted, and the town shook. Diablos retreated to his hold, but when the prince's forces broke open the gate open, he made his way to the castle and his throne, and set his throne up in it. When he set his standard on a nearby mountain where his men had set up the mighty slings, the mountain was close to Eargate and was called Mount Herewell. The prince stayed there because it was close to the gate. The prince commanded the golden slings to be put in motion against the town, especially against the castle, because Diablos had retreated there for shelter. Now, from Eargate, the street stretched straight to the house of Mr. Recorder, who spoke out with the voice of God against the sin of man's soul before Diablos took the town. Near his house stood the castle, which Diablos had turned into his troublesome den for a long time. For this reason, the captains used their slings to empty that street and clear the way to the heart of the town. With this accomplished, the prince commanded Captain Boriges, Captain Conviction, and Captain Judgment to march into Man's Soul and up that street to the old gentleman's gate. They marched forward into the town of Man's Soul at a most warlike advancement with flying colors. They came to the recorder's house, which was almost as strong as the castle, and they brought battering rams to plant against the castle gates. When they came to the house of Mr. Conscience, they knocked and demanded entrance. Now, the old man didn't understand their plan at this point, so he kept his gate shut during the entire fight. Beringes once again demanded to be let in at his gates, and when no one answered, he struck the gates with the head of a battering ram. It hit with such force that the house trembled and tottered, and the old gentleman shook. All this commotion brought Mr. Recorder down to the gates, where he asked with quivering lips, "Who's there?" Boringi answered, "We are captains and commanders of the great Shaddai and of the blessed Emmanuel, his son. We require possession of your house for the use of our noble prince." With that, the battering ram struck the gate a second time, which made the old gentleman tremble even more. He didn't dare ignore the order, but quickly opened the gate. The king's 3 brave captains marched through the gates and into Recorder's house. It turned out to be a suitable place for Emmanuel, not only because it was near to the castle and strong, but also because it was large and it faced the den where Diablos hid, and he was too afraid to come out of his fortress. With such a thunderous start, Mr. Recorder was unsure how all this would end, because he didn't know or understand enough to make a sound judgment. For this reason, the captains carefully explained Emmanuel's great plans, for he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace, and might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, by it having to put death the enmity. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. I want to reread that. For he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace, and might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, by having it put to death the enmity. Ephesians chapter 2, 14 through 16. Word spread throughout the town about how the recorder's house had been taken over and his rooms seized. His house became the command post of the war, and as soon as it was spoken of openly, the recorder shared the news with his friends. The frustration of these affairs was that the recorder was afraid. He trembled with fear, even though the captains explained the plan to him. So, like a snowball rolling in a snow and a little at a time, it didn't take long for his jitters to spread. Soon the whole town understood the prince held Mansoul by lawful title, and that they must expect nothing from the prince but destruction. Many came to see for themselves what was going on, and when they saw the captains in the house with their own eyes and the commotion caused by their battering rams pounding at the castle gate, they too were riveted with fear and stood amazed and perplexed by it all. Unfortunately, Mr. Recorder added to all this because whenever someone talked with him about what was happening, all he could talk about was the death and destruction ready to be served to man's soul. The old gentleman said, "You're all sensible and discerning. It's clear that we all once despised the now victorious and glorious Prince Emmanuel, and we betrayed him. We're all traitors. By now, as you can see, he not only endeavors to gain possession of man's soul, but has also forced his way in at our gates. Diablos flees before him. The prince has made my house a fortification against the castle where Diablos hides." Mr. Recorder wrung his hands. "I, for my part, have transgressed greatly. We have sinned, committed iniquity, acted wickedly, and rebelled, even turning aside from your commandments and ordinances." Daniel chapter 9, verse 5. Hello, John. He let out a deep sigh. "For the one who is innocent, it is fine for him. But I confess I have sinned greatly by keeping silent when I should have spoken, and by perverting justice when I have should put it into effect. True, I suffered somewhat at the hand of Diablos for taking part in the laws of King Shaddai." He glanced at the ground and shook his head. "Unfortunately, what good will that do now? Can that make up my disloyalties and rebellions I've committed, and the way I've permitted the town of Mansoul to follow the ways of Diablos without opposition?" The loud sound of the battering rams almost drowned out his voice. He placed his hands over his ears and said with such a dreadful and angry beginning as this, "I shudder to think how all this will end." Now, while these brave captains were busy in the house of the old recorder, Captain Execution was just as busy elsewhere in the town. His task was to secure the back streets and walls surrounding the town. He also hunted the Lord be will and didn't permit him a moment's rest. He pursued him hard and even killed 3 of his officers, slaughtered many who were brave and strong among his soldiers, and wounded numerous others who vigorously pursued business for Diablos. This caused Wilby Will's remaining followers to be driven from him. In fact, even Wilby Will himself was ready to thrust his head into a hole to hide. The 3 officers cut down by this mighty warrior included old Mr. Prejudice, who had his head cracked during the mutiny. Lord Wilby-Will had placed him as a keeper of the ear gate, and this is where he fell by the hand of Captain Execution. The second officer to fall by the hand of the captain was one Mr. Backward to all but naught, who, that's a long name, Mr. Backward to all but naught, who is the captain of the 2 guns that once were mounted on the top of the ear gate. Besides these 2, a vile man by the name of Captain Treacherous was the third. Wilby Will placed a great deal of confidence in this man, but Captain Execution cut him down just the same as the rest. All these who were slain by Diabolins, but among the natives of Mansoul, not a single soul was hurt. Other feats of war were performed by Captain Goodhope and Captain Charity as they executed the charge at the eye gate. With his own hands, Captain Goodhope slew Captain Blindfold, the keeper of that gate. This Blindfold was captain of 1,000 who fought with claws. Captain Goodhope not only killed this Blindfold, but also pursued and slew countless numbers of his men and wounded even more. The rest of them hid their heads blindly in corners. Mr. Illpaws stood at that gate, I mentioned him before, an old man with a beard that reached to his belt. This is the same man who served as orator to Diablos and bore much responsibility for a great amount of the trouble in the town of Mansoul. But after the charge on Igate, he would no longer trouble Mansoul, for he fell by the hand of Captain Goodhope. It's hard to describe the scene. Diablos lay dead everywhere at this time, but too many still remained alive in Mansoul. Now the old recorder, the Lord Understanding, and others who knew they must stand and fall with the famous town of Mansoul came together and deliberated as to how to proceed. They agreed to draw up a petition to send to Emmanuel while he sat in the gate of, Mansoul. So they drew up their petition to Emmanuel, and in it, the old inhabitants of the now deplorable town of Mansoul confessed their sin, expressed their sorrow for offending his princely majesty, and prayed he would spare their lives. For I am ready to fall, and my sorrow was continually before me. For I confess my iniquity. I am full of anxiety because of my sin. Psalm chapter 38, verses 17 through 18. Once finished, they sent it off to the prince, but to their dismay he returned no answer, and that troubled them even more. All the while, the captains of the recorder's house was employing the battering rams at the gates of the castle to beat them down. After much time, hard work, and effort, the castle's gate, impregnable, was beaten open. It splintered and broke into several pieces, making a way into the hold where Diablos had hid himself. News of this accomplishment was sent to Emmanuel at Eargate to let him know how they'd made a way in at the gates of the castle of Mansoul. After receiving this news, trumpets sounded throughout the prince's camp because the war was near an end, and Mansoul itself was about to be set free. The prince arose and gathered some of his fittest men of war for this mission. He marched up the street of Mansoul, dressed in his armor of gold, with his standard displayed before him. As he marched to the old recorder's house, the townsfolk came out at every door to see him. While they couldn't help but be taken with the glory of his person, his countenance remained reserved as he went. By the look of his face, the people couldn't determine if he meant love or hatred, and they wondered at the reserved nature of his countenance, for up to this point he spoke more by his actions and deeds than by words or smiles. But poor Mansoul interpreted the way Emmanuel carried himself with much the same way as Joseph's brothers had interpreted his behavior toward them, in a contrary way, which is apt to happen in such cases. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him?" Genesis chapter 50, verse 15. For they thought if Emmanuel loved us, he would show it by what he says and how he behaves toward us. But he does none of these. As a result, they determined Emmanuel hated them. With this mistaken notion, they thought if Emmanuel hates us, the Mansoul shall be slain and become nothing but a heap of rubbish. They knew they had transgressed his father's law and had been against him with Diablos, his enemy. They also were aware that Prince Emmanuel knew all this, for they were convinced he was an angel of God who knew all things done on earth. But my Lord is wise, like the wisdom of the angel of God, to know all that is in the earth. 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 20. And being aware of all this made them think their condition was miserable and that the good prince would make them destitute and uninhabited. They thought there is a more suitable time to do this than now, when he has the bridle of Mansoul in his hand. And as I watched this take place, the inhabitants cringed, bowed, bent, and were ready to lick the dust off his feet when they saw him march through the town. They couldn't help themselves, for they wished 1,000 times over that he would become their prince and captain, their protection. They turned to one another, talking about how he looked and how his glory and valor was far above other great ones in the world. God, in these last days, has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things. Through whom also he made the world, and he is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1a, and then 2 through 3. But even as the words fell from their lips, the thoughts of these poor hearts vacillated from one extreme to another until man's soul became like a tossed ball rolling before the whirlwind. For the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. James chapter 1, verse 6. Now, when he arrived at the castle's gates, he commanded Diablos to appear and to surrender himself into his hands. But oh, how unwilling the beast was to appear. He fell and cringed, but he was forced to come out to the prince. Emmanuel issued the command, and they grasped Diablos and bound him in chains to hold him for the judgment he had predetermined for him. But Diablos stood to make an earnest appeal for himself, asking Emmanuel not to send him into the deep, but to allow him to depart out of man's soul in peace. Emmanuel took him bound in chains and led him into the marketplace. There, before man's soul, he stripped the giant of his armor, in which he had boasted so much. This was one act of triumph of Emmanuel over his enemy. Diablos was being stripped of his armor. The trumpets of the golden prince sounded. The captain shouted, and the soldiers sang for joy. Man's soul was called to witness the beginning of Emmanuel's triumph over the one in whom they trusted so much, the very one in which they boasted in the days when he flattered them. After stripping Diablos of his garments in sight of man's soul and before the commanders of the prince, Emmanuel commanded that he be bound with chains to his chariot. Then he drove through the entire town of man's soul in triumph and out the gate called Eye Gate to the plain where his camp was set up. Emmanuel left behind some of his forces, including Captain Borginis and Captain Conviction, to guard the castle gate in case any resistance might be made on the giant's behalf, or in case any who had followed Diablos should attempt to possess man's soul again. Unless you had been there, you can't imagine the celebratory noise that sprang forth in Emmanuel's camp. For a great shout went out when they saw the tyrant bound by the hand of their noble prince and tied to his chariot. They said, "He has led captive into captivity and rendered his power useless. Diablos is subject to the power of his sword and made the object of all derision. Surely, thus saith the Lord, even the captives of the mighty man will be taken away, and the prey of the tyrant will be rescued. For I will contend with the one who contends with you, and I will save your sons." Isaiah chapter 49, verse 25. Among those gathered to see the battle stood those Diablos had deprived of their command. When they saw the giant in chains, they shouted with a great voice and joined the others in song. They sang with such melodious notes that they caused those who lived in the celestial orbs to open their windows and to look to see the cause of that glory. Many of the townsmen also saw this sight. For them, it felt surreal, like they were between earth and the heavens. They had no idea what the ultimate result would be for them, but all things were done in such an excellent manner. It seemed like a smile was cast toward the town. As a result, their eyes, heads, hearts, minds, and all they had were captivated while they observed Emmanuel's order. "Oh, sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done wonderful things. His right hand and his holy arm has gained the victory for him. The Lord has made known his salvation. He has revealed his righteousness in the sight of the nations. Psalm chapter 98, verses 1 through 2. So the brave prince finished this part of his triumph over his foe Diablos, and in the midst of all those watching, he informed the giant of his contempt and shame, and issued an order that he no longer be a possessor of man's soul. Then Diablos went out from Emmanuel and out of the midst of his camp to inherit the parched places in a salt land, seeking rest, but finding none. When the unclean spirit goes out of a man, it passes through waterless places seeking rest and not finding any. It says, I will return to my house from which I came. Luke chapter 11, verse 24. Excuse me. Now, Captain Borginis and Captain Conviction were men of great dignity. Their faces were like the faces of lions, their words like the roaring of the sea, and they continued to stay in Mr. Conscience's house. When the exalted mighty prince finished his triumph over Diablos to this point, the townsmen had the freedom to pay attention to what these noble captains were doing. But in all they did, the captains conveyed an awful majesty calculated to impress with terror and dread, and you can be sure they received private instructions to carry out. As a result, they held the town under continual heartache, and with the Mansolian's uneasiness of mind, this all worked to cause the future well-being of Mansol to hang in doubt, for they didn't know what rest, ease, peace, or hope meant for a considerable time. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 11. The prince himself didn't dwell in the town of Mansol. He stayed in his royal pavilion within the camp in the midst of his father's forces. At a suitable time, he sent orders to Captain Boriges and all the townsmen of Mansol into the castle courtyard. No, I'm sorry. He sent orders to Captain Boriges to call all of the townsmen of Mansol into the castle yard. Then, right before their faces, he ordered Lord Understanding, Mr. Conscience, and the notable Lord Will to be taken into custody and placed under strong guard until his intentions concerning them were made known. When the captains acted upon these orders, the town of Mansol grew more fearful, for to their way of thinking, all of this confirmed their former fears of the ruin of Mansol. They thought about the 3 men placed under guard and wondered by what manner of death they would die and how much they would suffer in the process. What most bewildered their minds and hearts was the fear that Emmanuel would command them all into the deep, the place the Prince Diablos was afraid of. They knew they deserved it. It troubled and grieved them to think they could die by the sword in the sight of the town, and they could be disgraced by the hand of such a good and holy prince. The town also worried for the men placed under guard, for they were their support and guides. They believed if these men were put to death, their execution would be only the beginning of the ruin of the town of Mansol. Wow. All right, that ends those 2 chapters. Hopefully I can read a little bit more later on. I can't say I can. I can't say I can't. I'm not sure if I'm taking my sister to the hospital to see her son or not. But until then, brothers and sisters, keep your eyes on Jesus and your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And let us embed the Word of God upon the tablets of our hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. I love you all. Yes, those are great books. I love these books so very much, John. God bless you.